all for joining us this morning. My name is Darla Eimers. I'm from Northwest Michigan Works up in Traverse City, Michigan. Obviously Michigan. Thank you for coming to this particular session entitled Key WIOA Issues for the Boards. Quick couple reminders, please make sure that your cell phones are turned off. All available workshop presentations and handouts are also available online, so you can check that out whenever after this is over. Make sure you give them feedback. They are going to send you an electronic email or message after this is all done with a little survey in it. Make sure you fill that out. Get back. One respondent is going to win a one-night stay at Soaring Eagle. And now I'd like to introduce you to your speaker. This is Robert Knight. He is the Director of Workforce Policy and Government Relations for ResCare Workforce Services. You, Robert.
Thank you. Good morning. You know, I decided that this casino was owned by somebody from the airline industry. That way they have all the chairs so close together. But it reminds me of my flight into Grand Rapids yesterday, trying to sit in one of those rows. But it is a pleasure to be here. How many of you? I've been at several Michigan Works conferences, although not in a few years. But I was outside of Warren. Was anybody else in Grand Rapids in Bear, up in Traverse City? We had Michigan Works there years ago. How many years ago was that? That was a long time ago. So I remember that one, but I've never been here. This is an interesting spot. I would hope that we have questions and sort of follow why you came, what you're interested in. Let me ask just real quickly, how many of you are on boards, on your local boards? Oh, a good-sized group of you. And how many are directors or other senior staff to the board? And how many of you came here because it was the best of a bad group of choices? Yeah, you don't have to raise your hand. Okay. What I thought we'd talk about a little, I wanted to talk a little bit about board evolution just because I think it's useful sometimes to understand how we got to where we are today. And maybe because I was a history major in college, so I like to do that. But I'd also think that we need, that one of the things I find is we use the word board very loosely. It means all kinds of things in communities, or WIB, as we often said. We don't say board, but we'd say WIB, and now I guess we're going to say WDB. Or how many of you know how many PICs are still out there? When I got started in the business, it was private industry councils, and in Boston, it's still the Boston Private Industry Council. So a few of them refused to let go of the name. And then I thought we'd talk about the membership structure of the new board, what their roles are, and then if we have whatever questions you have, we can try to deal with. We could discuss money, or we could discuss regulations. How many of you were in Rob Boehner's session yesterday afternoon? Just a couple of you. Somebody had asked the question, when are we going to get more money because we can't do it? And I guess what WIOA says to me, among other things, is you're going to figure out how to combine the resources of various federal and state programs because there isn't going to be any more money, at least not anytime soon. And so I look at it and say, if there's going to be a change in how funding occurs, it's going to happen after the next census, when the Congress is rearranged again based on the movement of people, and when all the members of Congress come from California, since that's where everybody's going to end up living. But no, I'm just kidding. But before that, so you're talking about, I think, at best, even funding for the next 5 years. So if you do a 5-year strategic plan, figure that your funding is going to be about where it is, up or down a few percent each year. More likely down than up, quite frankly, by a little bit. Having said that, there's at least a 50-50 chance that the government will close sometime around December 11th. They apparently reached a deal now so that the Congress will stay, the federal government will stay open until December 11th. My guess is it'll stay open, and they're going to pass a whole series of these. It'll be 60 days, 90 days, and it's going to go on most of the year, but we shall see. There's plenty of seats up front. The other thing we could talk about is regulations. So outside of, has anybody in the room read the NPRM? Oh, we have two. Wow, that's in front 3, somebody in the back. the notice of proposed rulemaking, which we like to call the regs, but they aren't. Well, you can have some questions on that. Certainly what we know about WIOA is the interpretations that are in that document, or there's actually several documents, and it's in those, there's two of them, one by labor and one by labor and ed, that essentially are the key ones. The others have to do with both rehab and adult literacy, or adult education and family literacy. Okay. One of the big changes in the law, which may upset some folks, is that the governors have, in my view, a lot more potential authority than they had under WIA. And they had more authority under WIA than they had under JPPA. And I think the experience of WIA was the governors never used much of that authority, and a lot of local people were just fine with that. The question this time around is, there's a big difference in the law, and that is by putting other state programs, both rehab in particular and adult education, and the potential to put TANF in, or at least the affirmative opt-out that you have to now do, or otherwise TANF is in. These are all state-administered programs in most states. And unlike WIA or WIOA, where the money does go down with real authority to local boards and local elected officials, those programs don't. So the governors, when I say governor, we're thinking more probably of state administrators than, I mentioned the governors don't get into the weeds of this stuff. I hope they don't. They must have something better to do. But as we look at this, the state has a bigger issue here than it was when it was just WIA. It was just federal money. And that also means in some states, state legislatures might want to start looking at this more carefully, simply because they put up some of the money and they authorize the spending of these other state programs. TANF in particular with Medicaid rules and folk rehab in most states. So anyhow, so that's one. If we go back on boards just for a minute, and I go back to CETA, so there's only a couple of us that can claim that in the room, I imagine. But CETA was signed by President Nixon, and it was a way to move the federal government out of the workforce system and give the authority to states and locals. And then too, because it was comprehensive, to consolidate programs. Now, one of the things you're going to find in all of workforce is we keep consolidating programs. So since 1973, we've been consolidating programs, and we still have more to consolidate. So somehow we're not very successful at what we call consolidating programs. We'll come back to that in a bit. But what happened in the 70s, more under President Carter than under President Nixon, is the CETA program became a public service employment program. And I remember talking with one of my Michigan colleagues back in those days. I was the director of the National Association of Private Industry Councils at the time, who was from northern, relatively rural Michigan, and he said, it's really pretty heavy. I'm 29 years old and I'm the largest employer in my area. And so I go out and have coffee on Saturday morning, and people come and ask me if I can get a job for their brother-in-law, their cousin, or whomever. And it became a big program. Think of it this way. $10 billion in 1979 were available for the CETA program. $10 billion. By today's standards, that would be roughly $30 billion going into the system. Instead, we have just less than $3 billion. So you can see that we're a tenth of the program that existed back then. Now, in all fairness, that's not a totally relevant comparison, because most of CETA was wages, and very little of WIA or WIOA is wages in the same sense. But anyhow, well, what happened, of course, was the business community became very disenamored of CETA. It became a four-letter word to a lot of them. It didn't really produce qualified applicants for the job openings they had. It seemed to that, and for a lot of business people, the government as the employer of last resort was a bad idea. So I think politically, philosophically, as well as practically, the program didn't work very well. And so under Jimmy Carter, Ray Marshall was the Secretary of Labor, they decided we got to change the image, and they came up with Title VII, which established the private industry councils on an experimental basis to see whether a business-led board could do a better job than just letting the elected officials do as they saw fit. And that was Title VII. Most of the money was still in the other titles controlled by governors and local elected officials, but there was this little pot of money, about 15% of the money, that was now available to the PICs. And that was called the new CETA, which lasted only until President Reagan came in and said, we're getting rid of new, old, I don't care, it's gone. And early in Reagan's era, and that's when Dan Quayle, who was the senator from Indiana at that time, and Ted Kennedy joined together, and they came up with the Job Training Partnership Act. So that was about 1983. I think that might be off by a year, but about 1983. Well, what happened? They said the idea that a business-led board is better than a government-only solution is the right decision, and so JTPA took the Title VII concept of letting these business-led boards run it, and they made that the whole program. Now also they got rid of all the public service employment, so the big hunk of that $10 billion was gone. But that was, and it was training, job training, so they said the emphasis should be on training, and it should be focused on the economically disadvantaged. And that was JTPA that was around for about 10 years, right? And all these bills, all these programs seem to have, what did I do wrong here? And which led in the early 90s to the idea that we still had too many programs. We may have had the Comprehensive Program and Job Training Act may have consolidated some, but we still had too many programs. And the solution was to put all those programs into a one-stop career center. So the core of WIA was sort of twofold. One was, let's run the programs through a comprehensive center. So even if people work in different agencies, they're all there, and customers, job seekers, can gain access to all of those services in one place. And the Labor Department actually gave states money to implement this before WIA ever passed. So when WIA came in, I think we all had one-stops already. So the transition, my point would be the transition was much easier than this one will be, because a lot of what the law changed we were already doing in the states. But the other key point was the private industry councils remained the boards. And what was the other big change though? They added the one-stop partners as mandatory members of that board. Now the result for a lot of people, in the minds of a lot of people, was now to move the emphasis of the board away from broader planning issues and begin to focus in on how the one-stop runs. And to a lot of business people, it became too focused on the things that administrators cared about as opposed to the things business people cared about. So that's been the ongoing push and pull that occurred all these years, it seems to me, in the WIA test in 1998, so it had a 15-year run. It was supposed to have a 5-year run, but it ended up being 15 years because, as you all know, the semi-dysfunctional Congress takes a long time to get anything done these days, and it took them 10 years to finally agree. And in fact, we were all surprised when they did agree, because we sort of thought that, those of us in Washington sort of thought that WIA was going to go on for another year when this agreement came up. So anyhow, the role of the PICs was enhanced in this period. So we've now had, when we look at locally business-led boards, just be aware that they go back to 1978. So it's not really a new idea. Your communities have had these boards now for almost a half a century. And we've had the issue that I don't want to get into too much is we also had our local areas for almost half a century, and that's another issue that's in the law that if you want to bring it up in Q&A, you can, but it's, I don't know why this is going, okay, I guess I did something goofy with my own slide, huh? But what happened and now if you think back for a moment, President Kennedy proposed what became CETA when he was still president. But why did he do it? He thought that we were going to see technological change lead to the loss of jobs in old manufacturing, especially in Appalachia, where he was campaigning very hard to win that election, and in parts of what we called the Rust Belt back then, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, into Illinois, a little bit of Wisconsin, that whole industrial belt. He turned out to be wrong, right? But President Johnson got the program through as part of the war on poverty, so they shifted from redundant workers, as the Brits would call them, I guess, they shifted over to low-income workers, disadvantaged, and because they had the money agreement, so they just changed what they'd use the money for. Now, it turned out President Kennedy was right, but he was off by 15 or so years, and we did begin to see a massive dislocation, 15 to 20 years after that. So that, which did lead to a program for dislocated workers later on. But there were dramatic changes in the world economy. One of the arguments, I guess, about why we need to think about new boards was that there were shifts in the economy. There's widening skill gaps, although we can have a heck of an argument about how to solve those skill gaps or even whether they exist. And so, I always tell people, if you want to get your PhD in economics department, you can take either side of the argument and do research to prove your case, that there is a skill gap or there is not a skill gap. And so you can go find both. Trouble is that all those papers have probably been written by now, so you probably have to come up with a new idea at this point. But we do know that the education and skill requirements of the workforce changed immensely over this period. And our super critics would argue that we're still doing things that were largely thought of in about 1935 in terms of labor exchange and about 1975 in terms of job training. And the whole world's changed, but we go on doing what we did. Well, one of the goals then is to create boards that would put an end to that to the degree that it's true. Because it's clearly not entirely true, it's only partially true or in some places true. And that was the beginning of WIOA, which you are now all in the first 3 months of. Now, I have to say this, the Congress was, and I have some, and these are the kind of things you can't really blame the members of Congress, they don't know any of this stuff, right? A couple of them have been on workforce boards. A guy from Pennsylvania was on his workforce board before he became a member of Congress. So there's one or two that, and there's a few others that actually know their boards pretty well. Some of yours may know their boards pretty well.
Who is that from Pennsylvania?
I shouldn't have said it because I had to pull it because,
That
you mean, who in Pennsylvania?
Senator or congressman?
I'm sorry.
Senator or congressman?
Oh, no, it's not a member of the House. Yeah, I'm not sure there's any senators that, you know who knew our programs real well, it amazed me. He was the governor of Arkansas, a guy named Bill Clinton. And I had him speak at the NAPIC conference one year. And so I got to, so I sent a couple of his pick people to pick him up over at the Hyatt and take him to the Renaissance Hotel in DC. And he came and spoke, and I mean, he really did know the picks as governor. Once he got to be president, he probably got a little ways away. You'd hope the president doesn't focus too much on private industry councils, but he did know that whole system, and he had a real business angle to it, So I mean, he was a big pusher of moving this system to a more business-driven. And to some degree, if you wanted to say how is JTPA different from WIA, I think I would argue much more sensitive to the needs of business than JTPA was. JTPA put tons of people in school and hoped they'd get a job when they finished. We still do some of that, but we do a lot less of it. I think we have a lot more investments in people that we are pretty comfortable the business community says this is what we need. So anyhow, WIOA, the question, we're going to go through this a little bit, but it's really, ironically, all the mandatory members of the board have been taken off as mandatory one-stop partners. They're no longer on the board, or at least they don't have to be. Electeds can appoint whomever they want. But we'll come back to that in a minute. There is a new emphasis. What's different about the one-stops now is if, in fact, all these mandatory things have to be there, and if you have to cut MOUs in which everybody's going to pay their fair share, quote unquote, whatever that means, of the infrastructure of the one-stop, you do have a much more complex environment in which the board's going to have to operate. Or if you read the law and you can't reach an agreement, then the state imposes a funding strategy on everybody. And with how it's going to play out in Michigan, you tell me, I can't really say. But second, business services have become far more emphasized. I don't think there's any new business services in the new law. I think it's just that they now are enumerated, so when an auditor comes in, you can't have a fight about whether you can do this or that. They're a fairly enumerated set of, which is good. I mean, that's much better when the law says you can do these things than when it just is silent on it, and we sort of do it. But we also have priority of service now. And if you recall, priority of service, well, for the board members who maybe never even had to think about this, priority of service in WIA said that if you don't have enough money to serve everybody, then you have to establish a priority of service to make sure that the most in need who can benefit, that's an important little subset of most in need who can benefit, get served. A lot of boards, probably some of yours, said we got enough money, so there was no priority of service. The new law says you have to have priority of service. There's no opt-out. You can't say we have enough money. So every board now has to establish a priority of service policy. So anyhow, work-based learning. My argument about this law would be we move away from ITAs and classroom structures and we move to work-based strategies. That the best way to get adults into the workplace is to get them attached to the workplace. So it's not necessarily work first in the old way, which was sort of, you know, I always look at TANF and say it was sort of work first and then forget about them until they have to work first again. But this is much more an OJT strategy, a customized training strategy, an internship strategy, apprenticeship strategy, invent your own model of apprenticeship, which would be, you know, I mean, registered apprenticeship and things that aren't registered, but they have many of the features of apprenticeship. So what you're saying to your community college partners is not that, hey, we're doing something different now, it's that we want you to be a partner with us in lifelong learning, but we're going to do it not through the old traditional class structure, because we're dealing mostly with 25 and up, people with family responsibilities and income needs. We want you to come in as our customized training person, as the provider of training to the employer at the work site in some cases, and others the students will come to you, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, that's one of the key changes in WIA. And the boards are supposed to become more strategic. Now, some of your boards are absolutely strategic already, and then that's an easy lift. And other boards, I think, have been heavily focused on operational questions, and for them, this is going to be a big change, or you're going to ignore it, one or the other. You may just ignore it and do what you've always done. But they want to be more strategic, and it's kind of interesting because Scott Cheney, who's the staff director to Senator Murray, and some of you may have met Scott, was speaking to the directors of the U.S. Conference of Mayors group. That's the big city workforce directors, although not all of them are big cities. But anyhow, so you know, a lot of the city folks were there, and Scott said to him, it was our intent when we passed this to get the boards out of operations and to make them strategic and decision makers about where the system is going. And he said, and it was my view that if they run one of the programs, then they're one of the players. And if they're above the fray, then they can make the players play together. But they can't be a player and make the other players play together. They have to be the commissioner of baseball, they can't own the team. That used to be my model, then Bud Selig became the commissioner of baseball and owned the Brewers, so it didn't work for a while, but he gave that up to his daughter at some point. So, unless you can make your daughter do what you want. So anyhow, but to be more strategic, to be more oversight, and we'll come back to what that might mean, because what I wanted to do in the rest of this session is sort of break down first off, just have this real brief discussion of what is a board, and second, look at and try to break down the functions of the board into some categories of things that the board is supposed to do. Because the other big change in this law is there's a long list of functions for the board, much more so than WIA, which sort of said you approve the plan and you cut a deal with the elected officials and so on, and you do oversight. This bill has a whole series of things that we'll go through that it says you're supposed to do. Now, some of them are things that staff do, and that's where the confusion comes in. The board could be a group of volunteers who have a legal and statutory authority to do something, right? But they're a board they could be incorporated or not incorporated. But it's the volunteers, it's the people sitting on the board. But it's also sometimes for a lot of us means the staff, right? We talk about the WIB, and what we're really talking about is the planning staff and the sometimes we're talking about the administrative staff, the people that are actually running the programs. And I would guess in most organizations, those two are all integrated. You have planning staff, and you have administrative staff, and they're all together, and they do the work. But they're not the board, really. And then you have the service delivery staff. So we go to some places, and you can have the planning staff, the administrative staff, and the service delivery people all work for County X or nonprofit Y, because you have a WIB that's nonprofit, and everybody works for them. And so all of those things mean board to somebody. Now, my thought is, let's back up to the first one, though, and say, what is it that the group of quote-unquote volunteers are supposed to do? I'm not going to claim in an hour and 15 minutes we can cover all the things that these groups might do, although maybe we can lay bare a few of the problems that exist in this law that I'm not going to be able to solve for you, but I know that they're inherent in the law. How many of you have approved, has Michigan approved the boards yet? The new boards, or are you still in a process? You've approved them?
Some of them.
Some of them?
A little over half.
Okay. So the approved boards would meet, you know, this membership goal, which is here. Ron said yesterday that he ran into a board that got down to 15. John Chamberlain, who some of you know, and I have worked together for years, and we sort of think 19 is the smallest you can have, although there are some two-hat strategies that might even get you smaller than 19. Remember, one of the drivers in the reauthorization, as we used to call it, since it's not called WIOA anymore, we don't call it that anymore, but in that reauthorization drive, the business folks all said the boards were too large. And we need smaller boards. So one of the things the Congress complied with was giving you smaller boards, or at least the chance for it. And so you've got the big actors, voc rehab, the employment service, adult education, higher education, which usually means a community college, but it could also be a university in some of your communities. The trick you're going to have is you've got to keep a majority business, and therefore as you add other seats, you know, I have a friend who runs the program out in the state of Washington, and she went in and said, I got to kick 2 of my people off. I was over to meet with her board. She said, I got to kick 2 of my people off. I said, what do you mean you have to kick them off? She said, well, you know, the law's real clear. We've always had these retired consultants on our board. And the law's real clear, that's not going to wash anymore, so I have to tell them that they're gone. And I said, well, number one, as director, you don't want to tell them, let the elected officials tell them, don't have to get mad at you, let the electeds tell them they're off. Number two is, you're the director, you don't get to decide who's on the board anyhow. But number three is, they can be on the board. The mayor, the county commissioners can appoint a category called other, and they can be on. The problem is, your board starts to get very large if you have people that are defined as other, because for every other, you have to have 1.5 business people, 1.1 business peoples. And so it's hard to do, and we're going to find some boards become quite large again, I imagine. If you have a board that's met this, I would look down at the standing committee rule as being the next thing you really want to confront as a board. Because the bill doesn't really require, the way the law was written, the board can do all the functions, but this was a fight that goes back to Senator Kennedy when he was alive. And when they said, let's get rid of mandatory partners, he said, well, we ought to have a one-stop committee, and they can advise the board about how the one-stops work. So you can have a one-stop committee. The second one was Senator Harkin from Iowa, who's retiring now, or just retired. Senator Harkin cares very much about disability issues, so he said, you gotta have a subcommittee that looks and makes sure that accessibility is honored and that opportunity is given to people with disabilities across the board. And then third, huge lobbying from the youth serving group to say we've lost our youth council, but we still ought to have a youth committee. Now, one of the things to be aware of here is if you don't set up these committees under the law, you have to do all the functions that are listed, because each of these committees has functions. You got to do the functions even if you don't set up the committee. So my sense is in most places you might want to set up committees, although I can't say that for definitive to each of you. You have to look at your own situations. But it would seem to me that one of the things to think about that's a real advantage here is they don't have to be voting members. So you can bring other people in and they can serve on these committees. Now, they're not voting members of the board, but they can serve on people who have more expertise in disabilities, can become part of a committee, and maybe the chair of that committee is a board member, who then brings their concerns to the other body. So you can do that with youth, and so you can keep some aspects of your youth council and just make them an advisory group to the board, put the chair on your board. So you can do that on all three of these, it would seem to me, and we'll come to other, because here's the thing, it's always struck me. Yes, we want smaller boards, because, you know, I ran into boards that are in the 40s and 50s and 60s, especially in rural areas. Number one, there's no place to fit everybody in a lot of places. You know, I go to rural Kentucky, eastern Kentucky, they all have to go to Lexington. There are no buildings in rural eastern Kentucky that would hold a board of 55 people. So they all trek over to Lexington, Kentucky. I think they like to do it, so they can do that anyhow. But so you've got that issue, but not only, but we grant that there's enough research on how groups work to suggest the following. A group of 30 or less, about 29 or less maybe, can make a decision of what the Congress would call a committee of the whole. You can reach agreement among 29. Once you go into the 30s, you have to have committee structures to get agreement or it's chaos. And what the psychologists who research this usually find is that then the trick is if you have a board that's up in the 30s or 40s, then the goal of the chair has to be to build trust in the committees. Because the only way that big of a board can function is the group has to trust the committee is smart and did the right thing when they come to the full board. So anyhow, so a lot of places will probably get boards down into the 20s, and that would seem to be the goal. But the other thing is this that I think about. The goal may be to have fewer business people or smaller boards in general, but the other side of the goal should be we need to build more business people that are involved in our work, not less. They don't all want to be on the board, but let's look at sectoral strategies where we get more people involved. Let's look at community volunteer efforts. I mean, the goal of the board should be to engage more business people, not to say, we're 20 people and we get to decide. I mean, that's sort of irrelevant to most people's lives. What you want to do is say, we need to get 100 business people, 500 business people who will make a commitment to work with us to ensure that we have the kinds of education and training and job opportunities and advancement opportunities that make our communities healthier. That should be our goal. So we need more, not less. So anyhow, and I think we can be misunderstood after 10 years of arguing that we need smaller boards, that it can be taken the wrong way. So, and to me, what you want to do is have a small board that can get work done, but you want a lot of people that are active in trying to carry out your mission. Okay, these are the planning functions of the board, and see how many there are. You have to develop a plan, and I guess here what the governor's trying to push it to be, or the state, I'm not sure if it's the governor or the state, but what the difference is, but trying to move towards a regional plan more and more, right? So the argument is, well, you can have a regional plan with multiple boards, or you can just get all those boards to become one board. I guess there are different ways to get to the same end. One way being more satisfactory to some, and one way being more satisfactory to others. But I think it's pretty clear in this bill, I should add. Well, there's a couple of pressures here that it seems to me are important. One is there is finally recognition that labor markets are the defining thing. Now, you know, to the extent that these regions are larger than labor markets, then we can have an argument about whether it makes sense. A legitimate argument, I think. But we do know that regions defined as the commuting pattern where people are willing to go to work is what matters to employers. They don't really care if you live in this city or that county. They only care, are you in an area where it's likely that you're going to come to work every day and be there on time and be able to work all day. And so that becomes a logical area for planning, in my view. And if the region's larger than that, then it probably has to have some set ideas in it about how you're dealing with different labor markets. But anyhow, that's the #1 duty of the board. It's to draw up this plan. And what I say to people is, It's a strategic plan. It's not an operational plan. I love to pick on my good friends, the directors, because I always recognized when I was the head of the National Association of Workforce Boards that the person who signed my check was actually the director, not the chair. And so if I alienated the directors, the checks never came in to pay for the association. So, but I used to say to them, even having said that, that the real goal of the board is to come up with a strategic plan. And to me, when I'd ask the directors, do you have a strategic plan? Of course, they'd all say yes. But when I'd ask to see it, they'd all tell me that they were working on it. They'd get it to me sooner or later. And the reason was because the thing that the governor wants or the thing that the feds want is not a strategic plan, no matter what they claim it is. It's an operational plan. And it's a guarantee of compliance to requirements that are set out in the law. So there's nothing wrong with it. But I think every board should have a strategic plan, and some of you do, in which I could sit down and say, what's your board trying to do this year? And they could lay out the 5 goals that you have. And to me, in a strategic plan that's doable, there's 3, 4, 5, maybe 7 or 8. I mean, it's up to you how many. But there's a way to, there's a countable number of things that you want to get done. Hey, you're a group of volunteers. You're going to meet at best once a month. In many cases, once a quarter. You're going to meet as committees more often than that to get work done. But let's not, you're not going to do all the things that are written in that law. The staff are. So I like to see a strategic plan that probably would fit on a couple of pages, and maybe one, in which the board would say, these are the things we're going to try to get done, and here's how we're going to try to do them. Now, we have a great director over here, and if you want to see the operational plan, he'd be happy or she'd be happy to share that with you. It does exist because but that's the professionals have done that. And I used to say to people, if you have to approve the employment service plan, don't approve the plan. It doesn't make, have you ever tried to read an employment service plan that goes to the Labor Department? It talks about man hours or some silliness about people. It's a distribution of people across the system. Nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't make any sense to the person who's serving on the board. I'd say what you ought to do as a board is bring the employment service or the rehab department or whomever your partners are, TANF, you ought to bring them into your board meeting and say, here's the 5 things we're trying to get done. How do the things you do align with what we're trying to get done here? And what doesn't align, and why? Those are the questions you want to know as a board. So, anyhow, so planning, the number 1 thing. Now, the second thing they say in the law is you do workforce research and regional labor market analysis. So I can see the board all sitting there poring over these. No, this is clearly something that the staff do, right? This is where it always gets confusing. Now you may want to, in fact, what I'm saying is, for a lot of this kind of research stuff, if the state can't do it for you, then you ought to, this is where certain kinds of regional partnerships make a lot of sense. I don't need to hire, if you have 22 WIBs here, 20 some, right? Or maybe it's going down to 16. We don't have to go there, somebody will get upset, but whatever's happening in that regard, you probably don't need 16 or 22 people with certain kinds of expertise. You probably could work for a group of you and do all the work you need done. So you ought to be really looking at savings and that. Third one is a board thing, convening or brokering. Now, I'm not sure what it means exactly, but it goes back to my point that you want to have forums that bring business people together to talk about what their issues are. And that, to me, is the brokering, convening. And that's going to happen when the board gets out there and calls it. Because if the director sends a letter out, it's a government bureaucrat and their idea, why would we don't need to come. So the board creates its credibility and I think does that. Employer engagement. Well, promote employer participation on the local board. One of the things I say that your strategic plan should always have one element is how do we make the board stronger? There should be one. How do we make the board learn more? How do we make it smarter and more influential? So we have a plan that looks at that. How do we make our meetings engaging? And you actually have a group of people, maybe it's just 2 or 3, that look at that. But it's a goal that you, at the end of the year you say, and how do you measure that? By attendance, maybe. But there may be other ways to measure it as well. So, but in developing effective employer linkages is in the law. Support employer voice. One of the key jobs of the board, and we could have a whole session on priority of service, targeting to people most in need, who can benefit, versus meeting the needs of employers in high growth occupations. You know, and one of the things I forgot to mention that is interesting when you go back to board members, it says about the board members what? That they should be, about the business people, they should be from companies that are growing and hiring and that provide training to their workers. So, I mean, now that's an interesting one as to whether states or anybody who's authorizing the boards is really going to look at, but it's an interesting thing to think about, is that you want business people from your key industries. So, you know, if manufacturing is key in your area, you want to make sure you have companies that are in manufacturing. You don't, if casinos are key around here, you may want a representative from the hospitality industry for sure. Whether it's from the casino or not, I'll leave it up to you. But one of your goals with all these employers is, do the dollar investments meet the needs of business? Are we really solving skill shortages, labor shortages, attendance problems? Or what are the problems we're trying to address? My friend Josh was here doing ethics in work, and to what degree, you know, is that important, and how do we deal with it? I mean, it's certainly important. Whether we should deal with it is an interesting question. And then you're supposed to develop and implement promising practices. Remember, it's the Innovation Act. Now, I always have to laugh because I'm a bit of a cynic on this one, because I think when you get to the U.S. Department of Labor, and I have a lot of good friends there, but I always find that you can be as innovative as you want as long as it works. Now, if we made Steve Jobs live by that, he'd be selling Apple computers that look like the ones from 30 years ago. I mean, you know, to be innovative, in all seriousness, to be innovative, you got to try some things that don't work, right? Or otherwise you're sort of on safe ground. Well, so one of the things, you know, I always laugh, the Department of Labor gets a lot of innovation grants. And it's clear to me that, that in those innovation grants, they're mostly things that we're pretty sure will work. So the real challenge to the people who get them is to hire the right people, because it's an implementation issue. It's not really a design issue. But as a board, you know, I always wanted them to say, and they obviously didn't listen to me, why don't you let every board have 5% of its money to do anything it wants, within reason? Maybe the governor will have to approve it so you don't get too crazy. But let them spend 5% and there's no performance standards, but the board has to define the outcomes and then tell us at the end whether they were able to achieve the outcomes they wanted. And I wish they had done that. To some degree, maybe the governors could, you could talk to the governor here and get some agreement to try some innovative things where you got out of this business of having to figure out whether you met performance standards. But the other thing is this, my guess is innovation strategies take a few years. And we always criticize corporate America now for being, you know, profits in the year is what drives the stock price and et cetera, et cetera. But it's also true for us that, you know, we tend to measure everything we do has to be measured in the grant year that we got it. And my guess is if I have a strategy to take, you know, one of the things they're doing in the UK that I find very interesting now is, and they're doing it in Australia as well, they're giving companies money. They're not giving it to them, they're doing performance contracts in which the companies will get their full payment only when it's shown over a period of years that that the targeted families have been removed from the welfare systems of their countries, or the dole as the British would call it. And if you do that over, say, 3 years, then you get your full, well, you know, you got to be a big corporation to do that, and most of them are European companies, I think, but there is one American company, Maximus, that's playing some of that. But it is true in the following, that if you really want to change low-income families, you can't have a 1-year measuring stick. You're going to have a strategy that probably goes up and down. Families have crises and they fall and then they rise again. You got to have a strategy to deal with that. So, but developing promising practices. Well, you know, the board's supposed to make sure this happens, but the staff have to probably help on this one. It's not like if I make steel frame trailers, I'm not sitting there reading about innovative training programs every night, probably. But anyhow, on coordination with education providers. You know, this is a big issue that you can look at. And then budget administration. You still have to have a budget. And you have to approve the administrative structure. And then last but not least by any stretch, we've mentioned the committee, but you have to make sure you have accessibility. And accessibility doesn't just mean that, you know, people with assistive wheelchairs can get into your facilities, well, that's one. It means that they have a reasonable access to all the kinds of training that you do and the assistive technology that's available. So those are the planning functions. And then there's promote state-of-the-art, which, you know, I think to some degree, well, one of the things they tell you is they want you to do career pathway development, which involves educators. Well, my sense is you can do career pathways for the whole state of Michigan. I don't know why you have to invent career pathways 22 times. So it would seem to me this is a natural place where everybody works together to develop something, and then the local boards and staff can tweak it in whichever direction they want. But it would seem to me we can do that. Second one, though, you do have to do to some degree on your own. You know, I had a contract years ago to go into Kentucky to all the picks. Back then, they were still picks, I think. And talk to them about sectoral strategies. Maybe they were workforce boards by then. And one of the things we found as we went around the state is everybody chose healthcare as a sector, which meant to me that there ought to be a way for everybody to work together. We don't need to reinvent 20 times healthcare strategies. But each board had to get local healthcare people in. So if there is a piece of the law that I say, get on the move in all of this, it's to begin to develop your sectoral strategies at your WIB level. And in areas like healthcare, I think the state could be a strong partner so you don't have to reinvent everything. And in some cases, maybe 2 or 3 of you can work together in manufacturing, which will be a big one in Michigan, to be sure. And but I think if there's, and one of, you know, the key for the board is you got to get the right people at the table. You got to get people from that industry who have real decision making or knowledge of training or both. Val, I used to be on the board of the One Stop in Montgomery County. Even though I worked for a for-profit company, I was on the board of a nonprofit One Stop that ran the One Stop in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live. And next to me was the head of HR for the local Catholic hospital, which was not too far from my house. And I used to look in the newspaper on Sunday at the amount of money that the hospital was spending to try to outcompete all the other hospitals to get nurses and other kinds of professionals into the hospital. And I said, you know, if you gave our One Stop all the money that you're spending there, and we had a challenge to outperform what those ads are getting, would you consider it? And I said, and what if we, and then I got, of course, then I got the head of the One Stop upset because I said, and if we fail, we'll give you your money back. And he said, wait a minute. But you know, if, as a business person, start thinking about how do people attract workers, and are there ways you could do that better? And could you get people to reinvest how they do it? It's an interesting thought. In healthcare, it's clear. In other fields, maybe a little tougher. And then you identify and promote promising practices. Well, you know, you're going to do that in conjunction with your staff. And then I had to put in the MOOCs. You're all aware of that. The only thing I can say is it's very hard to get pickup on online learning. Our company offers online, we call it Healthcare Academy, at a lot of our one-stops. And so I look at the pickup numbers, how many people actually use it. And unless you promote it really strongly, it's disappointing, I guess. The people on their own, no matter how much you say it's out there and it's free, they don't go home and decide that they're going to learn more about things. They watch football, I guess, or whatever they do. So trying to get people to engage is not impossible, but we haven't figured that one out as a company, I know, and I don't think as a system. But we do know this. If I'm the world's greatest geology 101 instructor, because I'm a flamboyant speaker and people love to hear me, and I can get a dime from everybody who wants to take that course in the whole world, I can be my own contractor. Right? I'll be the Michael Jordan of geology. I'll get paid by the whole world, you know, Mike loves Coke kind of stuff. I mean, I'll just make money everywhere. And I only need a nickel or a dime from each person, I'll be a multimillionaire. So one of the changing patterns of learning is going to be how we sort this stuff out in terms of learning that's going. But for what matters for the board right now is there's a lot of opportunity for online learning. And the board's supposed to look at that. Okay, now this one I just fly by because I don't know, you know, I have a hard time with technology, but the board's supposed to promote the use of technology. And when I said we tend to do things the way we did, well, you know, I'm not sure. You know, I talk to some people who think, now you have to go look at this yourself, because I don't know the answer, that in labor exchange, we're being left behind by private sector companies that are far more creative and aggressive and assertive to get into markets and identify people and do skill assessments and other kinds of material, all of it on the internet, all of it on computer, very few people. So I don't know if we're good, bad, or indifferent in that. And I realize that we also have this problem between the states and between the state and the locals. You can't, you know, there's mandated things that you have to use, and there's all kinds of privacy concerns that have to be met that some of these other companies probably don't have to meet. But technology in the one-stop, I mean, you know, it always seemed to me, and I may be wrong on this, but I always thought that we were now at the point where instead of mandating a bricks and mortar one-stop, we ought to give local people the right to use technology to spread out the one-stop. Because you could have people everywhere, especially in rural America, instead of saying everybody has to drive somewhere to get to this thing, you could start making access much more easily available by cross-training your staff to do all these things in different small towns and cities, libraries, moving vehicles, whatever. But they didn't see it that way, and so we still have to have these bricks and mortar. Although, you know, interestingly, it's another driver for governors to have fewer areas, because if you have 5 areas, then you need 5 of these one-stops. If you have 50 areas, you need 50 of these one-stops. So when you start looking at money, it becomes a driver of how you think about this issue, if you're at the state level. But anyhow, here's some of the things in, you know, what does it suggest to me? I think the board needs some outreach or participation by people that do know technology and the ways we use it, which are education, labor exchange, economic development to some extent. And we need some people on the board that understand that, or friends of the board. Maybe they aren't board members, maybe they just help you with it. Okay, performance. You know, we always get back to saying you can be the most innovative, creative, wonderful board in the world, but if the programs aren't any good, nobody's going to listen to what you have to say. So you end up in this strange conundrum between you're being told to be strategic, above the fray, but on the other hand, you realize that there's a piece of this that has to work or everybody will think you're crazy. And so you negotiate performance standards. I'm not sure I've ever seen a board that actually negotiated them, right? I think directors have to negotiate that. Or actually, I have to laugh because I thought maybe the Congress would finally realize that what they call negotiation, I call the ETA tells the state what they're going to do, and then the state tells all the locals what they're going to do, and we call that negotiation. But there ain't much negotiation in most states. No, I know it's different in Michigan, but in the other 49 states, I know. See, I never get invited back to some of these things. And you have to do some oversight for your, you know, we mentioned this, youth, adult, dislocated worker. But you know, one of the things you might want to play with as a board is the staff are going to sort of, the staff and the contractors, vendors, whatever you want to call them, I mean, they live in a world of meeting these standards. What you might want to look at as a board are some other things that we ought to be looking at. Because the staff, I mean, you know, but for one thing, when you look at Department of Labor, WIOA, which don't start till next July 1, the new standards, whatever they're going to be, but you know, they're all in the rearview mirror, right? You go to a board meeting and you have somebody tell you what we did last quarter. You know, and so I'm saying, well, who would ever drive a car by looking in the rearview mirror? Unless they were backing up. But hey, I like my Toyota with a little camera in the back. I think that's pretty cool. But since I have a '98 car, they haven't come up. They hadn't invented it yet. But one of the things you want to think about at a board meeting is you need to be focused on where we're going, not where we were. Now, somebody's got to worry about that, because if you get put out of business because you failed, so somebody's got to go watching it. I understand that. But the board meeting should be, I've always said the board meeting ought to have a committee for every goal. If you have 5 goals, you have 5 committees. If you have 3 goals, you have 3 committees. When you come to the meeting, the committee's report is not, you know, I go to board meetings now and the program committee tells us what happened in the adult dislocated worker programs the last quarter, for the last month. And I realize your meetings aren't that way, the other 49 states it's that way, but, and then the youth committee tells us sort of what's going on. If you had 3 goals and you had 3 committees, those 3 committees would tell you, this is what we're trying to get done, this is the amount of progress we've made so far, these are the challenges we've run into, this is where we're going to try to be a year from now. And the other thing is, a strategic plan like that is a live plan, because now you, instead of putting it on a shelf once you wrote it, you now have to defend it at each meeting you go to, which means you also get to change it when you discover that the realities of life are a little different than you had thought. So you modify your plan, not so that you can beat it, you modify it because the external realities have changed. And that way, you don't have to keep, you know, it's not a one-year plan anymore, it's a plan that keeps moving as you keep moving. And what you do decide is sometimes we're not going to work on that issue anymore, so you disband the committee, and all those people say hooray. But the other thing is when you do that, so if you have a marketing group, you don't have to have a bunch of marketing experts on your board. Bring them into the committee. Have them work with the committee to help you do it. You know, and my experience with a lot of volunteers is they'd rather be asked to volunteer on something that they feel they're fairly expert upon, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, than be asked to serve on a board about which they don't really understand what the board does, and once they're on, they can never get off. You know, I remember my wife used to be the head of the job service committee in Washington, D.C., and she said after a year she realized her real job was to find her replacement or she'd never get off the board. And so for a lot of people coming in to do, you know, but you know what else happens once they get involved? They love what they're doing. Now they want to be on the board. What's a better problem, to be hunting for board members or to have people that are hoping to get on the board one day? I'd rather have a bunch of people that think this is important work and they want to get on than have a committee that's going out asking people, please join our board. And so those are some of the things. Now we get into some things that have always been sort of, they were contentious in the law, and I guess they're going to stay contentious in their implementation. The board has to select service providers. Now, when I told you Scott Cheney, who is Patty Murray, Senator Murray from Washington, who was the chief Senate negotiator on this bill, you know, and he met with the big city mayors, he said, we screwed up in the bill, but our intent was that the boards not run programs and that they select operators for everything. That was our intent. But he did say, well, we screwed up, and so it's not as clear as what we want. And he also made an important point that you have to realize. Once it's left to Congress, it doesn't matter what he thinks. It now matters what the Secretary of Labor thinks and the Office of Management and Budget thinks. So it no longer matters that Scott Cheney thinks that maybe they screwed up. What is. But we do know this. If you read the NPRM, and a couple of you have read it, and it's hard to remember, you know, if you read this thing, after a while you can't remember what you read. I mean, you know, if you want to worry about something, one of the deputy assistant secretaries was speaking at the SETA conference, Southeast Employment Training, a couple of weeks ago, and Jerry Fiala is her name, and Jerry said that, and in fact, Jerry, my wife used to live in Michigan, in Lansing, and worked in CETA back in the 70s, and Jerry Fiala worked with her. So Jerry, who's now in Washington, has a Michigander background, lived up in the Lansing area at one time back in the 70s, maybe even to the early 80s. Anyhow, be that as it may, what Jerry said is we have to statutorily respond to all the comments that were submitted to the NPRM, of which there are thousands. And she said, now we're going to try to group the ones that are almost the same. But she said, be prepared when the final regs come out. There might well be hundreds of pages of preamble of all these discussions that have occurred. So, you know, so it may not be as bad as it looks when you first hear that it's 1,000 pages long. It may be the first couple hundred pages aren't really germane, they're just a discussion. But anyhow, the NPRM right now says that you must select the program out with the one-stop operator. And it lays a very high bar if you don't do that. You have to show that there wasn't competition. You can compete, the board can compete for the position. But then you get into a hornet's nest of conflict of interest rules that are run by OMB. And we don't have time to go through that, but I mean, I would almost say the state is going to have to be very liberal in its interpretation of what a conflict of interest is, because I was talking to an attorney out in California who does this kind of litigation. He said there's no way in a court of law you could win the argument that you didn't have a conflict of interest in any choice. So it's a real thorny issue, just be aware of it. But you have to choose the operator. And if you don't want to do that, you have to get your local chief elected official and the governor to agree that you don't. But you have to show that you tried to do a competition and it didn't work. You have to do that. Now on the second level, which is where the real money is, by the way, because nobody knows what an operator is. I mean, this is the other irony of the thing. Yeah, there's no definition of an operator. And I don't think there will be, beyond the function of they unlock the doors in the morning and they sort of make sure everybody plays nice and the rent gets paid so you don't get thrown out, a few things like that. To a very, in one part of the MPRM, they talked about the operator negotiating the MOUs, which means they'd be a ancillary to the board, because the board has to agree to the MOUs for all these partners, or one master MOU for everybody, whichever way you want to go, which is a different workshop than we have time for today. But so number two though is for the vendor, which I view as the real money. That's the staff, the counselors, or whatever you want to call them, the business service people, maybe, although they might not even be there, they might be on the whim. That piece of it you can get out of more easily. The bar is lower to say, we the WIB want to run that, and if the electeds agree. Now, one of the things that some governors could do that would help a lot is to say, are they going to honor waivers or are they not going to honor? I mean, because if the governors aren't going to honor these kinds of waivers, then you might as well forget about it, because it's got to have governor's agreement that you're going to run it. So if you're interested in running it as a WIB, you need to probably want to solve that one as early as you can, because if the governor says no, there's nowhere to go. He's going up a blind alley. So, I mean, that's a huge issue for the board, and a difficult one, I realized. And there's not, my view is not a right or a wrong on it. Here's what happened that I think was the mistake, quote unquote. If you read the history of the discussion, there was agreement early on that in the big urban areas we ought to move to a competitive procurement system for almost everything. But that in rural America, you don't have the same kind of staff infrastructure to say we can afford that. You don't have the dollars maybe to afford it. And so the early things were to allow waivers to rural areas from the governor to do things a little differently. But somehow between the Republican House bill, which was very much consolidate all the programs into one program and give it to the governor, and the Senate, which was much closer to status quo, that whole argument, like a lot of things, got lost. I mean, they cut a deal, and a lot of the stuff that had been talked about for 10 years just sort of disappeared in the final deal. And any of you who've done that kind of dealing realize sometimes in a complex argument, certain things just get forgotten about in the end, and that's what apparently happened here. But we got to live with what we got. So, in fact, there was an effort to make some technical corrections to the bill. I was talking to Scott Cheney, and he said there was clearly no agreement from the Democrats in particular that they wanted any of those changes in the end. But some of them would have had Republican opposition, some would have had Democratic opposition. So there are only two things that were in the technical amendments, which nobody paid attention to. It passed in April, I think. One was to allow the rural SEPs, of which you have none in Michigan, to keep their identity. And the other one was put a comma here and an apostrophe there that were sort of messed up, that didn't really have any meaning. Okay, so you can award contracts for career services if not provided by the one-stop. But anyhow, so the thinking here is that the WIB is going to run a competitive procurement to some degree. And I say to some degree, because you're going to have to decide beyond the operator what degree. And of course, and here's the thing that I haven't talked too much about. The language of this bill is much more emphasis on the partnership with the local elected officials than we actually had. So when I say the WIB decides this, or the WDB, because the word WIB goes away, but so now if you want to be a workforce investment board, you'll be like Boston, still a private industry council. You can keep the name, I guess, but it's actually Workforce Development Board and WDB in this bill. If you, you know, as you talk this through, if the things you want to do need to be agreed to with the local elected official, and in the case of some of these real thorny ones, they're going to have to be agreed to with the governor. And so where do I see real thorny issues? Well, this whole question of operator and providers is a thorny one. I was out, and certainly Michigan is not the only place. This is an issue almost everywhere. I was out in California, and California has 49, I think, workforce boards, and I think they have 7 in LA County alone. And some of the big cities have always competitively procured, and they don't care. I mean, it's fine with them to change this. But a lot of them, our company operates youth programs in Riverside County, which is way on the outskirts of LA area, and the one-stop's run by county staff. And you may have some of this situation too. It's real uncomfortable, and county officials don't want to lay off county staff, and the staff don't want to be laid off probably. And it's not that the board even wants to, so it's a thorny issue that in each case you have to sort of work through and decide what makes sense. So it's that issue and this whole thing of how we're going to have MOUs. I think that's the other thorny short-term issue is, the law now says that the voc rehab people should pay for infrastructure. Now what's happened in most of the country is we have voc rehab people, and we have other people, but the fact is most of the infrastructure is either paid for with Wagner Pfizer money or WIA money. There's very little other money coming in. Now if I had a slide here that showed you all the partners that are in this law, it takes 2 columns. Now if you're going to have an MOU with all of these partners, I mean there's a couple dozen. There's Job Corps, there's Trade Act, the list goes on and on. There's the Food Stamp Employment and Training, FSET, or whatever they call it now. So there's a whole bunch of programs that are supposed to have their services in the Career Center, and you who are on the boards are supposed to have agreements with all these people. Hard thing, and a lot of that has to be staff driven. You can't have a group of volunteers sit around. I think they can provide some guidance as a board, and you're going to have to decide in the end. But the irony of it all is if you can't reach agreements, then the state imposes an agreement on the whole, probably on could impose it on the whole state, I guess. I'm not sure what the states are thinking at this point. The feds are taking the position they'd like to see the boards negotiate this, and which I wouldn't disagree with, but I do have this sense that, if you're a state agency, are you going to have 5, 10, 15 different types of agreements? It seems to me that there's going to be an agreement that's acceptable to that department, and all of them are going to be essentially the same agreement. Based on size and other things, it wouldn't be the same money, but it would be the same structure to determine how much money, if any. And of course, none of these agencies want to put a penny in if they can help it, right? So there's feet dragging right from the get-go, and you can't blame them, because they've structured their services in a way that, where's this money going to come from? And so that's sort of, okay, a couple of things to look at. The state WIB, which we haven't talked about, but the state WIB is an interesting question. Anybody here on the state board? Nobody. Huh?
The Talent Investment Board?
You're on it?
Yes.
Okay, we have one. Okay, you guys can all meet with him afterwards. I'm kidding. The state board is supposed to have its plan in April, I think it is, for the consolidated plan. Now, it's a plan that has to show how you're going to integrate employment service, all the 4 parts of WIOA, at a minimum. If the governor also has to decide is TANF in or out as an integrated partner, it has to be in the one-stop, but it can be in or out as to whether it's part of the unified plan. So the governor has to drive that. Well, I'm told, and I can't speak for Michigan, but I'm told almost all the states plan to have a draft out by the end of the year. Because there got to be time to respond to it, right? Because they have to have a public thing, and if you're going to have a final plan in April, you got to have something for people to comment on. Then you have to have enough time to let them comment. So you're gonna get 2 days for that, and then you got, no, you're gonna have 30 days or 45 or 60 days for the comment period, and then they have to take the comments into account. So if you're gonna have final plans in April, yeah, you have to have something by the end of this year, sooner if possible. And so you want to watch that, because I would guess that's also going to lay some parameters of how, as boards, they see you acting. So I guess my final point here would be, I think you have to view the transition as being a couple of years long, and not get, you can't do all these things on day one. I mean, for one thing, the law said we're going to do all these things, but the board doesn't exist till July 1, right? And so there are a whole bunch of things that were supposed to happen before the board even existed. And then there's no explanation of how the board came into being. And then the state doesn't even have a plan until the first year is gone. And there's no reg, and as much as the regs by law are supposed to be out in January, they ain't gonna be out, folks. They're now saying spring. Well, spring goes all the way to the 15th or 20th of June, right? 21st of June. And the new year starts the 1st of July. So the period of uncertainty is going to go on for another year plus, is my guess. And from a board's perspective, instead of getting too excited about all that, I just say, let's look at this as a 2-year transition in which we're going to do sensible things. We're going to understand that sometimes we don't like decisions coming from on high, but we're going to move forward in a positive mindset, and some of these things will work out over time. Well, I think we're about out of time, but are there any questions? I mean, we could go on, because each local WIB would have a whole series of issues we could go on for hours. Yes?
If there are 2 boards being seated and we have this regionalism being accomplished here in Michigan, what do you think is the best way to train the board to bring this, introduce all this new stuff? And as you do that, what would be the top 3 things that you would bring to a new board, that you would teach or train them?
That's a good question. I think I'd want to focus on what's the mission here, what are we really trying to get done, and I'd focus on work-based learning, sectoral strategies, innovation, sort of some of the bigger picture things. But then my second part would be, there are some decisions that will drive credibility over time, and we need to figure out what our role is in those. And those include the operator question, the providers, but also the whole MOU structure, which brings all the partners in. If you went, most of you didn't go to Ron emphasized the importance of partnership in this, and I don't disagree with him. I tend to have a different way of focusing on that, but it is important that we develop those partnerships, but a lot of those are staff-based partnerships. And to some degree, they already exist. And it's not as though yesterday was the first day of the history of anybody knowing what Bolt Rehab was. I mean, so there's a lot more there than we think, but there are some technical implementation questions that are pretty tricky. So I'd make sure the board understood those. Maybe the third thing I'd want to do is make sure if I've got a new board, this is my history degree coming in, I think they need to understand where we came from. And the reason they need to understand that is otherwise we'll never understand why some people are hostile to them, or others think they're great. I mean, if you don't know why any of this stuff was, then you don't understand how the community has feelings. And, those feelings are, so the people that are in the anti-poverty area have feelings, positive or negative. They're different in every place. So do the economic developers, employer groups, chambers of commerce. They all have views of what's good, bad, indifferent, unexplored in your system. And I think a new board, now if they're old board members, then you don't need that. But if there's a lot of new people, I think they need to have a discussion of not only where those feelings come from, but what can be done to turn as many negatives into positives and make sure you keep the positives you already have. So I guess those would be 3 areas I'd focus on. But then the other thing I'd add is, I think you're going to have to treat several months of learning. The buck only absorbs, the mind absorbs what the buck can endure, right? So at some point, if I sit there for 3 hours and run this stuff by everybody, they're gonna. Maybe you should try some online learning and help see if they can, halftime of the football games, pick up a little piece of this stuff. Any other questions? Okay. Well, you've been great, and I appreciate the attention.